When it comes to saltwater fly tying and fly tying in general, there's a wide variety of materials that you can choose from when tying your flies. And one material that has become extremely popular throughout the years are synthetic materials. Not only for the reason that it is readily available and quite cheap, it comes in every single color you can imagine, but there's a wide variety of techniques and different flies you can tie with the plethora of synthetic materials on the market today. In this series, we're going to be discussing different materials in depth, starting off with synthetics, talking about the techniques, the various patterns, and how I use them the most. Now, why are synthetic materials so popular nowadays in saltwater and freshwater fly tying? In the past, the majority of flies that we saw tied in the 60s, 70s, 80s were tied with natural materials, and still today, natural materials are still extremely popular. One of the reasons why synthetics have grown in popularity over the years is the wide variety of synthetic materials that have come out on the market. Back when I was growing up, there was a much more limited selection of materials available. And nowadays, there's essentially a synthetic material to imitate any sort of natural material, as well as a wide variety of materials in between, all sorts of different textures and qualities about them that can change the fly in the way that you tie it. I first really started getting into synthetic fly tying at a young age, getting certain materials like Supreme hair or Ultra hair, and with the boom in saltwater fly tying in the early 2000s with materials like Slinky fiber, EP fiber, and all sorts of different materials coming out. Over time, slowly adding different materials to my arsenal and what I like to use in my everyday fly tying. With that being said, there are some pros and some cons to synthetic materials. So we'll go over both of those and how they differ from natural materials. So the pros of synthetic materials are that it is widely available and it is quite affordable. You can find, like I said, just about every type of imitation for a natural material with modern day synthetic materials. But there's a lot of materials that are essentially, they're quite unique in the way that they react in the water and how they tie on the hook. So you essentially have an unlimited choice of different synthetic materials to use, and they're coming out with new materials all the time. A recent synthetic material to come out in the past 10 years or so is Squimpish hair, for instance, which was quite different to anything else that was on the market. You can get essentially any sort of color you'd like. For instance, in EP fiber, there's just about any color imaginable, including blends between colors, so you can get a wide variety in appearance in the materials. And it is quite durable as well. One of the pros of synthetic materials, it is an extremely durable material, so it's fantastic for toothy critters or fish that are quite rough on flies. One of the reasons why synthetics became popular up here in the Northeast is for bluefish. A hollow fly tied with bucktail would get destroyed after a single bluefish, but a synthetic Sodati slammer, for instance, will last an entire day of fishing and more. So not only the fact that it is widely available in every color and durable, but it is somewhat easy to work with. I think it's pretty friendly for new fly tyers, especially materials like, for instance, EP fiber. You can trim them, so even if you make mistakes, you can clean it up afterwards by trimming the fly. And it is a lot of these materials comparable to, for instance, learning how to tie with bucktail and try and master that. It could be easier to try and wrap your head around how to tie with these materials. So not only is it readily available, it's durable, it comes in every color under the sun and every texture that you could think of, but it is pretty easy to work with as well. So those are the pros of synthetic materials. Now, as with everything, there are benefits, but there are also negatives. The downsides to synthetic materials, really the biggest one I'd say is the fact that most synthetic materials don't breathe in the water like a natural material would. So something like bucktail or marabou or feathers, these natural materials, they have so much innate movement in the water. Even when you're not stripping the fly, the material is breathing. Synthetics, on the other hand, a lot of times they don't have that innate breathability or that movement to them. Some do. Squimpish hair, for instance, has great movement in the water. Craft fur is another example, and we're going to be going over these materials and talking about them in depth. That is probably, I'd say, the biggest downside to synthetics is you compare something like marabou or bucktail in the water or feathers to something like Slinky fiber or EP, there is a lot less inherent movement to it. A downside or a negative that I see a lot of times with synthetics is it's so easy to add too much material. Something that we see a lot of times in newer fly tires when they post flies in Discord, or they send me photos on Instagram or something and ask me questions, is they just use too much material on the fly. It's very easy to add too much material with something like EP fiber, for instance, that could drastically cause the fly to then not swim properly. For instance, just adding too much material on one side, let's say the belly side with V-ties tying a kinky muddler. If you add too much material on the belly as opposed to the top, it'll cause the fly to then not turn over properly. So you do need to be careful with the amount of material that you use and where you're tying it on the hook shank. So that's something that you learn over time. That being said, I think comparable to like trying to master a hollow tie or something, it's much easier to then just figure out you need to use less material in your V-ties, for instance. Another downside to synthetic materials is that it can be messy sometimes working with it. Whether it be, craft fur or EP fiber or squimpish hair, you can make quite a mess when tying with it. So sometimes after a long session, you can end up with so much of this stuff all over your desk and your pants and everywhere all over the floor. So it helps to have a brush to be able to clean it up, or use your hands to kind of ball up the material, because a lot of synthetics will catch on each other. But that is another downside of synthetic materials, is sometimes it can be quite messy working with it. But speaking of using a brush, sometimes synthetics can also tangle up pretty bad when it comes to fishing for toothy critters or even striped bass. So it's a good idea to keep a brush with you. Again, synthetics at times have a tendency to kind of wrap on themselves or fold over themselves in a way that it can knot up and things like that. So it doesn't happen to all synthetics, but certain materials are more prone to getting tangled and fouled. So it's a good idea to keep a brush with you when you're out on the water and use the brush as you're tying the fly. But with that being said, I think the benefits generally outweigh the negatives when it comes to synthetic materials, especially just the fact that it's so readily available and it is most of the time affordable, comparable to, let's say, $30 bucktails. So now that we've done our introduction discussing synthetic materials, the pros and cons, and just overall what synthetics are all about, I guess we should get into each material in depth and what flies I tie with them, and how I often use these materials the most. Now, one thing I did want to point out is I may not mention every single material. A lot of materials actually kind of overlap. A good example is Slinky fiber and Steve Farrar fiber are very similar. Steve Farrar fiber had its origins in just taking Slinky and mixing it with Flash. Another example is there are brands that kind of have like very similar materials, like EP fiber is, very famous. And there are some materials that are very similar to it, like Fly Tires Dungeon's Congo hair, for instance. So I'm not going to mention every material, but I'm just going to mention the ones that I use the most and the ones that I thought maybe were worth mentioning. But if I did miss any synthetic materials, perhaps materials that you either use in your everyday fly tying or ones that you thought were interesting that I missed, be certain to leave them down in the comments below, and perhaps I'll check it out in a future video. And with that, let's get into some various synthetic materials. So first up on the list is Big Fly Fiber. This is an old material that has been around for quite a while, since at least the 80s. And I first learned about it in Popovic's Pop Flies, his first book. And he used it to tie these very large flies. And this predates all the bucktail hollow flies that he was tying on the mono extensions, like the beast flies. So he was using it to tie these large offshore flies as well as these big bunker flies, and using them for sailfish and marlin and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's a very interesting material, and it's been around for a long time. I think Larry Dahlberg also used it for his Mega Dahlbergs, if I'm not wrong. I found that out doing a little research. But it's definitely like one of the original synthetic materials that were pretty popular in saltwater tying, but you'd see it mostly in larger flies. I had some orange here. This is what I was using for some offshore flies, particularly for shark flies. It's a nice long synthetic material we were tying on tubes, you could see, and it was very effective for that. We found the orange particularly was working well for sharks, but it's a very interesting material, and it's worth giving it a try once if you haven't tied with it before. I would liken it very similar to something like clown hair, or Popovich mentions bozo hair, so it's very similar to like a synthetic clown hair. You can see there's a wide variety of colors that it comes in. And when it comes to techniques for the Big Fly Fiber, realistically, you're just going to be either tying it on their standard. You can do a pseudo hollow tie, if you will. But really it's just high-low tying with the material and building up that profile and bulk. If you're interested, I highly recommend checking out Pop Flies, because he goes in depth on how to tie the cotton candy fly, and I'm not going to spoil it here. We may cover it in a future video. It is somewhat limited in the actual techniques that you can use to attach it to the hook shank, I think, as opposed to other synthetics. And it's definitely an old school synthetic material that I felt like was worth mentioning. So next up we have dubbing brushes. And dubbing brushes are very useful when it comes to saltwater and freshwater fly tying. It's a very easy to use fly tying material. Essentially, if you're not familiar with them, it's 2 pieces of stainless steel wire, thin wire, and they put material between it, and then they spin it using a drill or some sort of machine, and you get a taut wire with the material spun in between it. And it's very useful when it comes to palmering on a hook shank in particular. Dubbing brushes come in a wide variety of materials, sizes, and colors as well. You could find things like EP brushes. You can make your own dubbing brushes like we've done in the past using natural and synthetics. David Nelson from Squimpish Flies, he does a lot of dubbing brushes nowadays with that material. It's a very easy way to add some body and some profile to a fly. And if you're feeling adventurous, you can either make your own. There's videos on there. If you're a craftsman and you're good with any woodworking, you can easily make your own dubbing brush, or you can buy a dubbing brush table and essentially make your own brushes. So it's a lot of fun to use. Now when it comes to techniques for tying with this material, what I usually do is just wrap it onto the hook shank and usually building a head on a fly. And by building a head with a dubbing brush, we can get a nice chunky profile in the front, which will allow the water to then flow over that dubbing brush head, hitting the backside of the fly and creating that nice action. It's very useful for taking a fly like a bucktail deceiver, for instance, and just in the front section wrapping a 3-inch EP Foxy dubbing brush. And that's essentially how we get a GT slammer for saltwaterflies.com. By just adding a dubbing brush to the front, you can drastically change the profile of the fly and also how the fly swims and how it reacts in the water. It's also very popular in things like articulated flies and things like that. You can finish off a jointed section with a wrap of a dubbing brush to create, again, that nice head in the front, which will cause the action in the material behind it. When it comes to flies, there are tons of different flies you can use dubbing brushes for. There are just quote-unquote dubbing brush flies, they call them. But I generally use it as a finish for the front of a fly. So like we mentioned, the GT slammers that I've tied for saltwaterflies.com in the past, that's a very typical sort of fly that I'll use a dubbing brush for finishing the front of a fly off. Now getting inspiration from the GT slammer and essentially tying like a Sedati slammer in the rear using synthetic materials or natural, and getting a much larger profile, much larger fly on a heavier hook with a lead keel, and then finishing off with a dubbing brush in the front, and that's how we get the jungle slammer. This is an idea that I had when my buddy Jeff was heading down to South America to do some peacock bass fishing. By combining the GT slammer and the Sedati slammer together and getting a lead keel on there and that larger profile, and putting that dubbing brush in the front to get that pushing water effect, you know. It's not only imparting action in the rear, but the dubbing brush in the front is that larger head is pushing water, and in murky, dirty water, perhaps where peacock bass are, they're going to pick up on that with their lateral line. Most fish that are predators will pick up on the movement of water, and that's one of the main ways that they also, predate on bait fish. This fly came in very handy, and I think not only the lead keel and the Sedati slammer style profile is one of the reasons why this fly did so well. Again, the lead keel causing it to turn over properly and sink at an even rate, but the dubbing brush head in the front really helped push the water and help those peacock bass find that fly in the water. He said that the jungle slammers and these flies with the dubbing brush flies, you'll see different photos, they outproduced every other fly that he brought with him. And I think really the dubbing brush in the front is a big reason why, along with the weighted keel on the hook. And again, the way that I use these the most is just finishing off a bucktail deceiver style fly or a larger, let's say, slammer style fly, and wrapping in the front of the hook shank right behind the hook eye and giving us that nice bulky head in the front. Alright, so next up is craft fur and polar fiber. Craft fur is one of the materials that I've been tying with the longest when it comes to synthetics because it's readily available at many local craft stores. And I did want to mention that craft fur and polar fiber are very similar, at least I think they are. Now, they are two different materials, but I think you can use them in very similar ways. So I just wanted to point out, you could see here polar fiber. It's a material that's been around for a while. The polar fiber baitfish is a very popular pattern. That's maybe where you've heard of the material before. And it's just essentially a very soft and subtle material. It comes in a wide variety of colors, just like craft fur as well. But I did want to point out that I think they're close enough to where we can mention them in the same category here. Now, when it comes to craft fur, it is very soft and wispy material. It's very breathable in the water. It's one of the materials here in synthetics that we're going to be talking about that probably has some of the most breathability in the water. So it really moves even when you're not stripping it. So it's a great material for imparting action in a fly. It's usually very easy to find, like we mentioned, even at craft stores. These aren't fly tying grade craft fur. You'll see some craft fur I have from a Michaels or something like that. And it's generally very short and there's a ton of underfur. But it is a material that you can use for crab flies, you can use for dubbing, you can make dubbing brushes with it. So there are ways that you can use it, or if you're tying very short flies, for instance. But there is a very big difference between qualities of craft fur. So next up we have a just generic fly tying craft fur that you can find. We have some in tan here, but it comes, just a wide variety of colors like every other synthetic. And the quality is a big improvement over the Michaels or the local craft store craft fur. And it's generally longer, and it's like I said, a big improvement. But what you'll find is you're still going to have a lot of underfur. So you're going to end up cutting a lot of hair off the patch, and you're going to find that you're going to have a lot of waste once you pull out all that underfur that you don't want to be tying on the hook shank and adding bulk. And that leads us to quote-unquote premium craft furs. Rainey's craft fur is really what I believe to be like the best quality craft fur out there. That's what we use at saltwaterflies.com for some of the flies like the bunker buster that I've tied them in the past. And that's where I first got introduced to it. And it's not only some of the longest craft fur that you'll find, but it also has very little underfur. Every craft fur will have underfur and some waste to it, but there are ways that you can mitigate that when it comes to how you actually trim it off the patch, for instance, which I'll show you. But again, this is probably the highest quality craft fur that I've found, the Rainies. And shout out to saltwaterflies.com for introducing it, because in the past I kind of got discouraged using craft fur because the quality was so low. Not only that, I couldn't always find polar fiber, for instance. It is available, but it wasn't available locally for me and stuff like that. So the Rainies craft fur definitely saved the day when it comes to my use of craft fur nowadays. And when it comes to techniques for craft fur, again, you can either just tie it in the tail section of a fly for movement because it is very breathable. You can high-low tie it or just high tie it like how we do it with the bunker buster, or very similar to the polar fiber minnow, right? You can hollow tie it like a flex candy, for instance, like we've covered in the past, and just tying a piece of ram's wool, for instance, on the inside and hollow tying it for support and then coating it in flex resin. That's a very interesting fly that I love fishing in the fall. And you can make your own dubbing brushes, for instance. So there's quite a lot of ways that you could use it, and like I said, you can also just top a fly off. So like Henry Cowan's shrimp scampi, for instance, which we haven't covered on the channel, but we will soon. The rabbit strip style bonefish fly, but he tops it off with craft fur on the top. And after talking to him about it on one of our live streams, in fact, he mentioned that the reason that he tied the craft fur on there was that even when you're done stripping the fly, that craft fur is still breathing and moving. And that might impart a strike from a bonefish or a permit, let's say, right? So craft fur is very useful in terms of that. It is very subtle though and soft, so it can foul on you. So if we're tying a, for instance, the guide fly, which is a Paul Dixon style Mickelson's epoxy baitfish that he's had me tie in the past, we make sure to extend the resin past the bend of the hook slightly, just to make sure that that craft fur is less likely to foul on us. The bunker busters here that we tie with the craft fur, essentially just high ties, one on top of each other, and a very classic style of saltwater fly. Another fly that we use some craft fur with is a fly we haven't covered before, but the Jamie Boyle's Boilermaker is a popular fly in the Northeast. I remember seeing these back in the day. and I like using craft fur for the wings on these as well. And a fly that we've covered in the past, the classic gotcha bonefish fly, uses craft fur. And again, I think one of the things that you'll see with certain flies like the bonefish and permit flies, where you may be stripping a fly and stopping it, and a fish may inspect the fly with great detail. The reason why people use these soft and subtle materials like rabbit strips and craft fur is that it has that movement even when you're not stripping it. How I use craft fur the most, I would say, is generally the high tie, like the bunker busters, but I do enjoy sometimes either incorporating it into a hollow tie on the inside of a hollow tie, like a Squimpish tie, or I'll just hollow tie at the front of a fly, and sometimes maybe coating it like with a flex resin fly, like the flex candy, but sometimes not coating it as well and sticking some eyes on there. So there's a lot of different things you can do with craft fur. But if you've only used, I would say, like the generic fly tying craft fur, or the dollar store or the craft store craft fur, I highly recommend picking up some either Rainey's craft fur or some polar fiber, and you'll see the difference in quality with this material compared to the generic stuff. One thing I wanted to mention, I learned this from Chris at saltwaterflies.com. A way that you can be very efficient in cutting the craft fur off is laying it flat on the table, and then taking your scissors, hopefully they're fine point scissors, or a bodkin works as well, and running it into the craft fur. And that way you can kind of run the scissors along the base of the patch, ensuring that you get all the hairs and separate the section that you want. You can even go further to try and then pull out some of the looser lower hairs if you want. But that kind of gives you a much cleaner way of getting it cut, and you want to lay your scissors all the way down on the bottom of the patch, cutting as close as you can, because you want to get the most material off and not waste any. It's very easy to waste craft fur by just cutting it, pulling it, and cutting it. It's much easier to get a nice clean cut by laying it flat and using your scissors to kind of get in between the craft fur and then cut it that way. That leads us to EP fiber. Now, EP fiber, I would say, is one of the more popular synthetic materials, and it really grew in popularity during that saltwater boom that I talked about in the early 2000s. I remember seeing EP flies and the material popping up all over the place in catalogs and magazines and fly shops and stuff like that. And it's a very easy to tie with material, and also somewhat shapeable when it comes to trimming. It's very easy to kind of get the shape that you like with it. Now, it comes in a very wide variety of not only different colors, but it comes in different textures. There's the Sculpta fiber, there's the classic EP fiber. There's a wide variety of EP fiber out there. There are some materials on the market as well, like I mentioned, like Congo hair, that are quite similar, but EP fiber is kind of the original in terms of, I'd say, synthetic materials in regard to this type of material. Not only does it come in the classic and the Sculpta fiber, but it's used in a lot of the brushes that EP makes as well. Now, one thing about the material is it's somewhat buoyant, but that could be used in the design of the fly, but you need to be careful with how much you use, because it could easily turn into a fly that will not sink very properly and will not turn over at all. Now, when it comes to techniques using EP fiber, I usually V-tie. The classic EP fly just essentially consists of V-ties and high-low ties and things like that. Very simple. And again, high-low ties are something that you can use with this material as well. Again, it's very trimmable. So if you just V-tie the head in the front, very similar, akin to like a kinky muddler style fly, you can trim it and get a 3D profile, or if you focus more top and bottom and trim it, you can get that kind of classic EP baitfish style fly. The other thing you can do with it is, recently we mixed it with some Steve Farrar fiber and hollow tied it. And it turned out surprisingly well, and then coating that with some like liquid fusion, for instance. So that's something to think about, is stepping outside your bounds and using some of these synthetics in ways that you haven't before. And like I said, another popular thing to do is taking the EP fiber and making a dubbing brush out of it. Essentially, you could take rubber legs, EP fiber, and some underfur from like a bucktail or craft fur, for instance, and put it all in between some stainless steel wire, spin it together on a dubbing brush table, and you have a custom crab dubbing brush, for instance. And like I said, it's very trimmable as well. It's very easy to shape the material. You don't need the Sculpta fiber, for instance. You can use regular EP fiber as well. And just by building up a 3D profile and trimming it, you can get all sorts of different shapes and profiles, all sorts of different baitfish imitations with relatively the same technique. Now, when it comes to flies for the EP flies, I highly recommend checking out, for instance, just go to saltwaterflies.com and look at all of the various EP flies that are out there, or you could probably even head to EP's website. The classic EP baitfish, where it's essentially just high, low ties or V ties, and you can essentially take that sort of pattern and scale it up into a larger size. So you can see I have some colorations that I've tied for some tarpon guides in the past, and then we scaled it up into a larger kind of either roosterfish or striper sized baitfish fly. Another way that I love using EP fiber is in crab and shrimp flies, like I've mentioned. I have a pattern, the V-tie crab fly, essentially just using tying like a merkin style crab fly, but with the V-ties. It's really effective fly, very simple to tie, and you can, like I said, using a V-tie and this material, you can easily get a 3D profile, which you can then trim and shape. So that's a great way of kind of showing off the V-tie and the trimming when it comes to tying with the EP fiber. And it's very popular, like I said, with tarpon fishing and snook fishing in the mangroves and stuff like that, because the material itself is somewhat buoyant. It causes the flies to kind of hit the water with a very soft and subtle sound. You don't want a fly that's going to slap like a clouser minnow. It's going to slap the shallow waters and potentially scare away a tarpon or a snook or something like that in the mangroves. So these sorts of flies, this particular material really hits the water with a soft and subtle landing, which is great for that shallow water fishing. That being said, it does tend to ride a little bit higher up in the water column if you're not using a heavy enough hook to keel it and get it down. So you need to be careful with how much of the material you're using. It's very easy to overdress a fly. But again, the good thing is you can trim it. It's a nice thing about this material. One thing is you want to try and avoid is using too much material and having to trim it all the time. You can find that by just adjusting the length and the amount of material that you're tying in for your V-ties, your high-low ties, you can get the shape and profile you're looking for with using minimal trimming at all when you're done with tying the fly. And when it comes to how I use this material the most, generally, like I said, the V-tie or the high-low tie in the classic EP style baitfish, and I'll use that sort of technique up in the front, like kinky muddler style, and use it for roosterfish flies as well. And the other way is using it the V-tie with the crab flies, like I've mentioned before, building a body shape essentially with the EP fiber and trim it. And last but not least, using it with dubbing brushes. Making your own dubbing brushes is a lot of fun. It's something we'll cover in a future video if you folks are interested. And essentially just, it's a great material for that sort of medium of fly tying, making a dubbing brush. And of course you can use all sorts of different materials, but I found that EP fiber works really well in dubbing brushes. So next up is fish hair. This is a very old school synthetic material. This is, I'd say, one of the earlier synthetic materials that were around, probably from the, at least I'd say 70s or 80s. And I remember seeing this particularly in certain tackle shops, even like smaller tackle shops that were less fly orientated. You would see sometimes fish hair and maybe some flashabou and like a couple bucktails or something like that. So it was not only used in saltwater fly tying, but probably as well, perhaps like some either jig making or like the parachute jigs, very similar sort of material that you would find in certain lures at the time. I remember seeing it quite a lot in Lefty Kray's books. I'll see if I can find some footage, but some of Lefty Kray's saltwater fly pattern books from like the 90s, you'd see a lot of flies that were developed in like the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And again, there was a wide variety of synthetic materials, so most of them were naturals, like deceiver type flies and all sorts of stuff like that. You would see some folks using synthetics, and fish hair was one of the popular materials back then because it was some of the only materials. I remember there was trying to find the exact name. I'll look it up and I'll make sure to put it in the video, but there was a fly like the witch fly, either a Rhode Island witch or something like that. I'll see if I can find the name, but that used fish hair. And I believe even in Ray Bondaru's books, he mentions in Stripers and Streamers, fish hair as an alternative or as used in some of the flies. Because again, there wasn't many options back then. Even when it comes to flash, they were using things like tinsel and stuff that wasn't even made for the fly tying market. Now, when it comes to tying with this stuff, again, either just your standard kind of tail material, you can tie it and then tie some on the head, if you will, like blonde style. You can tie it in high tie style or high-low as well. And it's essentially, I would say, it's very similar to the faux bucktails that are out on the market. I haven't tied with the faux bucktail too much, but I would say it seems like it's pretty similar. So there might be some merit in attempting to do some sort of hollow tying, but it seems like the fibers themselves perhaps might be a little too stiff when it comes to that. So that's why I think it was used in like parachute type jigs. But I'm sure there are certain other techniques you can do, perhaps when it comes to maybe applying some sort of adhesive as well and trying to manipulate it. But generally, I just use it in a standard tie, and I don't even really use it too often. So I think we're going to have to use it some more in the future and experiment with it. But again, just like with the big fly fiber, it is a material that has been around for a long time, ever since I was a kid. So I figured it was worth mentioning. And that leads us to Fluoro fiber. Now, I don't even know if this is I do consider this to be a synthetic material, but talking to Henry Cowan recently, I think it's actually classified as a flash material. It's a very sparse, somewhat crinkly material, but very fine. Taken out of the package, you could tell it's very soft and subtle because it has that static electricity type effect where the hair is just almost levitating. So it's a very fine and light material, but it has this kind of a fine crinkly effect to it. When I got this package, it was a very small amount, but there's a reason why I bought this particular material. I was lucky enough that one of my viewers, Zeke, is good friends with Henry Cowan. And if you don't know Henry Cowan, we'll be covering some of his flies here soon. But back when I was growing up, he was, he's a very prolific fly tyer, and he had some very famous flies, including the Cowans, like Silverside and the Anchovies, which really impressed me as a young fly tyer. I really tried imitating them at times and struggled because they're beautiful looking flies. So, including his Magnum baitfish and his regular baitfish flies and stuff. So he sent me some flies we'll be covering here in the future. But the whole idea behind this Fluoro fiber is that he uses it in the throat of flies. Now, it's one particular color. It's the hot pink. And talking to him on the phone in depth about it, it essentially has this color changing effect. And talking to him, essentially it seemed like whenever the fly had the Fluoro fiber in it, it outperformed every other fly. And they actually did tests on days where they're like the fish were biting and or were hard to catch, right, and stuff like that. So they had like a somewhat controlled sample size, if you will, fishing in like a harbor or somewhere. I was a little skeptical, talking to him about it, that it was such a game changer. But when I got it in my hands in person and I actually had it under the camera and started moving it in the light, you can see it goes from being a hot pink to a purple to an orange to a red. I've never seen a material that actually does this before. And I actually had to zoom in here, but you'll see the colors actually change, and it's really just the variation in how the light is reflecting off of it. So you could see here, this is a Magnum baitfish that Henry sent to me himself, and I don't think it actually is Slinky fiber. I think it's like some sort of like yak or artificial yak, but it's very sparsely tied. But you'll notice that the Fluoro fiber in the throat, even on the fly here, it's a little bit harder to see, but as I turn the fly, the colors actually change on it. It's much more visible when you have a big piece of Fluoro fiber, a big wad of it in your hands. With the naked eye, you could see it very easily, and I believe you can even see it here on the camera. It's something I wanted to point out because he's very adamant in it, and generally with these fly tyers, that have been doing this for a very long time, like my ideas or these beliefs about certain things, I generally take it with quite a lot of confidence. It doesn't have to be the gospel, right, necessarily, but it's worth, taking these things in. And if somebody's been tying flies for 30, 40 years or, whatever, and has been very successful, making a career out of it and being a guide, whatever, it's important to take these little bits of information and store them in the back of your head as a fly tyer. So I just wanted to point this out. It's really just mostly used in the throat of a fly, but perhaps you could use it as normal flash running along the back of a surf candy, for instance. So, but again, it's the hot pink Fluoro fiber is what you're looking for. So shout out to Henry Cowan. We'll be covering some of his flies here in the near future. And if I can, I would love to potentially get him on the channel at some point for a discussion or something, because he's an amazing fly tyer and he's a wealth of information when it comes to striper fishing. And if you haven't figured out already, we're going in alphabetical order. That brings us to Seno's Laser Dub. Now, Seno's Laser Dub is a very interesting material I only started using about 10-12 years ago, and I mostly use it for a very similar effect to the dubbing brushes, where I'll make a head in front of the fly. But it's actually like a dubbing-like material. You can use it to dub on a body of a trout fly, for instance, or something like that. But it makes a great streamer material as well. Now, it's limited in its length because it is essentially like a dubbing like material. And you'll see here once I pull it out and actually start working with it, you kind of have to taper it in your hands to get it to like a usable size and get it to where you can actually work with it. I found it works quite well for building that larger bulky head on a baitfish fly. And you'll see it's again a very fine wispy material. It doesn't necessarily have as much action as something like craft fur, because I think the material actually kind of clings to itself, or each fiber kind of grabs on each other, but it does have some nice action in the water. And it actually has some flash blended in, so you get this really nice kind of 3D effect with the material when you tie it on top of other materials. So when it comes to techniques for tying on Seno's Laser Dub, I usually use it, like I said, for the head building. And when I tie it like that, I will tie it either in a 60-40 technique, which you've seen me do in the past, where 60% of the material is towards the back, 40 is towards the front, and we tie right in that 40-60 center, and then fold back that 40%. Or we'll do like a half hollow, where we tie it right in the middle and then fold it back. So you have some material hanging off the back, and then you fold it. It's a way of building like a bulkier profile with it. You can certainly V-tie with it, and high-low tie and things like that, or like I said, you could dub it, you know, for like a crab or shrimp fly. I've used it as a straight-up dubbing before as well. I tend to use it at the front of a fly, or on a articulated fly at the front of a jointed section, for instance. And just to get it to where you can work with it, you just kind of taper it in your hands so that way you get some of the shorter hairs out of the way, and you kind of need to get them all lined up and straight to where you can tie it on. One fly that I use Seno's Laser Dub in is one of like my only quote-unquote original flies, if you will. It's essentially just an amalgamation of multiple flies, but one of the only flies I've ever named, I guess you could call it, is the Mullet Marauder. And it's essentially like a flat wing tail, bucktail deceiver style body, and then a Seno's Laser Dub head in the front. And the Seno's Laser Dub head in the front kind of gives you that bulky head where you can get that action then flowing into the flat wing tail. And again, it's a great way of building a 3D profile, so that's where the mullet comes into play, because they have that kind of round cigar-shaped profile to a mullet, so it's a good material for trying to get that profile. Another way I'll use it, like I said, is in articulated flies, either using it at the head of the fly or using it at the head of a jointed section. You can also just, like I said, use it as a straight-up streamer material, either V-tied or, you know, doing these half-hollow ties in between bucktail collars just to get some flash, for instance, and build up some profile and get some depth. There's a wide variety of ways you can use Seno's Laser Dub, and it's really just limited by your mind. I'm sure there's many ways that I haven't used it yet, dubbing brushes and all sorts of different techniques that you're kind of just limited by the length of the material. But again, I mostly use it as a way of building up a bulky head so we can impart some action into the rear of the fly. So it's worth checking out some Seno's Laser Dub if you haven't. Next up is Slinky fiber and Steve Farrar fiber, or SF blends. Now, this is probably one of the materials that I've used the most in my fly tying career throughout the years. I remember seeing it utilized very well by Mark Sadati when I was a kid. This is when he was really getting into converting from the large Schlappenhackle Sadati style slammer flies with the high ties or high-low ties, and converting it over with the synthetic materials. And I saw him blend Slinky fiber and angel hair and essentially make Steve Farrar fiber right in front of me. And I actually still have that original fly, which you'll see that we filmed here. But it's a fantastic material. It's not too soft, but it's not too stiff. And it's not too crinkly as well. It's kind of like that perfect middle ground for a fly tying material. And it works very well for just building a baitfish body for instance, or it comes in quite a large size as well. So if you taper the material and then V-tie it or high-low tie it, you can tie quite a large fly. It's quite easy to work with as well. And I remember this along with like EP fiber back in the day in the early 2000s, for instance. This was one of the main fly tie materials that you would see utilized. Steve Farrar, for instance, had examples of how to blend this material with flash to make his SF blends on, I forgot what website it was, the like Salty Fly Rodders or something like that. They had a website back in the day. I forgot which club it was, but it was the one that Steve Farrar and Bob Popovics were associated with. So I've been using this for quite a while now. And it is, like I said, very useful for tying large flies, but it's also useful for building a 3D profile, like with a kinky muddler. So how do I mostly use this? What are the techniques I mostly use when it comes to Slinky fiber? Well, mostly, traditionally I've used Slinky fiber with the high-low ties or the 60-40 ties, V-ties, if you will, to build a Sedati Slammer style fly. It's very good in that regard. Magnum Baitfish by Henry Cowan, that sort of style of fly, using either V-ties or high-low ties to build your profile. The main thing you need to be very careful about, just like EP fiber or really any synthetic material, is that you don't use too much material. So you want to be very sparse. It's very easy to add too much material and end up wasting some or having to trim some down. The material does trim quite easily, but it's always better to try and use less material and have to reduce wasting any material or have to do any unnecessary trimming to the fly. So again, the V-ties and high-low ties and those big bunker flies are kind of like my main preferred way. And the other way is using it in a V-tie to build a head, like the kinky muddler. So I've tied a lot of kinky muddlers, particularly last year for the folks going down with Rise Fishing Co. for roosterfish down in Baja. And, you know, after tying hundreds of these things, it's a very efficient way of building a 3D profile on the fly. And the material is quite different to EP, so you can like build a 3D profile with the EP in a very similar way, but the flies will react a little differently. I think the Slinky fiber does sink a little bit quicker than the EP fiber, for instance. And you can do some hollow tying with it. We've done some hollow tying. It's surprisingly works pretty well. You might need to use some adhesives. I would do it in the front of the fly, for instance, but essentially the front of a kinky muddler is a pseudo hollow tie, so you know you can hollow tie with the material as well. Now, there's a wide variety of flies you could tie with it. I'll list off some of the flies that I tie most often with this sort of material. Cowan's Magnum Baitfish and Sedati Slammers, Mark Sedati's Slammer pattern, are great flies for this sort of fly, like I said. Bob Popovics also used it for some 3D flies as well, like his 3D pattern. I believe it's the 3D Baitfish or something like that, and the spread fly, things like that. So you can use it for all sorts of different larger baitfish patterns, and it works quite well. Another larger fly, it doesn't have to be tied large, but I had the pleasure of meeting him recently at the Edison show this past couple weeks here. Rich Murphy and his Conamoy Special. So I'm probably not even pronouncing that right. I had him pronounce it for me, and I'm still pronouncing it wrong. But he ties that fly in naturals and with bucktail and whatnot, but I've seen them tied in larger versions with synthetics in the past, and Slinky fiber is a great material for that. You can build up quite a large profile, but we're not adding too much weight and bulk to the fly. And we mentioned it already, but if you haven't checked out Johnny King and his fly tying, he is not only an amazing jazz musician, but he's a fantastic fly tyer. And he is a master at utilizing Slinky fiber and SF blends to tie his kinky muddler. So there are some similar materials which I've seen used for his style of flies, like the kinky fiber, I believe it's called, or this like fuzzy fiber that I think some of the musky folks use. So there are similar materials. Like, again, I'm not mentioning every synthetic out there. Again, if you haven't, I highly recommend checking out Johnny King, and we have some videos focusing on some of his flies, like the rooster kinky muddler, for instance. And not only with baitfish flies, but it can also be used to imitate crustaceans and invertebrates as well. So the kinky muddler squid fly, for instance, as well as I've seen plenty of squid flies in the past with sort of like Slinky fiber sort of esque bodies built out of it, right, in the past. You can use it as tail material as well, of course, if you always want to. You could, of course, again, V-tie it for crab flies, or you can use it with dubbing brushes, or just tie it in, off the tail section of a shrimp fly, for instance. It's a great material that you can use in all sorts of ways. Now, how do I tie with Slinky fiber the most? Like I said, the V-ties for the larger Sadati style flies, or the Henry Cowan sort of bait fish flies, and high-low ties, as well as the smaller V-ties and the hollow-esque ties for the heads on kinky muddlers as well. That's probably the most common way that I use Slinky fiber in my everyday fly tying. Now, I haven't mentioned it specifically, but is there really a difference between Slinky fiber and SF blends? I don't know. I've used it a lot. At times there'll be differences even between packs of Slinky fiber, but I would just consider them to be very similar materials. And the SF blends are great. They come in a wide variety of colors and blended different hairs along with the flash, so they're worth checking out for sure. I use them quite a lot. But you can also learn how to make your own blends with Slinky fiber using angel hair, which we've covered in the past, but we might make a dedicated video on that in the future. But essentially, you just take some Slinky fiber, take some angel hair, and just blend them together until you get that sort of Steve Farrar fiber-esque blend where the angel hair or the Winin flash is naturally blended with your Slinky fiber. And because we're going alphabetically, that brings us to my probably second most, if not maybe potentially over the Slinky fiber, my most used synthetic material throughout the years, and that is Supreme Hair. Now, Supreme Hair is, again, an old school material. There's Supreme Hair, Ultra Hair, Super Hair. There's probably 15 other hairs out there that are very similar to these. Now, between Super Hair, Supreme Hair, and Ultra Hair, there are slight differences. Some are more, crinkly, some are straighter, some have a softer texture. But I primarily use Supreme Hair, but they're all quite similar, like Ultra Hair and Super Hair as well. Now, I got first turned on to this material from Pop Flies and Bob Popovics and tying synthetic surf candies. That's really the way that I've used it the most throughout the years, either in pink over white, chartreuse over white, tan over white. If you've seen my channel here, or if you see my fly tying on Instagram, you know that I've tied probably thousands of synthetic surf candies over the years, and Supreme Hair is the material that I've used the most. It's generally very consistent. Sometimes you will get some hair that is a little bit more coarser than others, but for the most part, it's quite consistent. The only downside is I found sometimes some inconsistency in getting the same color, and sometimes some pink will be duller than others and stuff like that, but other than that, it's a fantastic material for tying synthetic surf candies. Now, you don't need too much of this material. This is also another synthetic material where you could easily add too much. Just kind of learning over time how much material to use and fishing your flies and like paying attention to how your flies react in the water, right, is really important. Seeing whether they swim properly or whether they sink quickly or they float on the surface and vice versa. And it takes UV resin or epoxy very well. So again, coating your Supreme Hair with like a surf candy style fly, it works very well, and it looks great when it's coated in the UV resin as well. And like I mentioned, you can use it in the tail section of a fly, particularly if you're fishing for something with very sharp teeth like a bluefish or barracuda or something. You'll see a lot of older like needlefish style cuda flies with the tandem hooks or whatever. They were using hair like Supreme Hair or Ultra Hair. This is just a cheap, affordable hair, readily available, and very durable. So how do I use Super Hair the most, or Supreme Hair, Ultra Hair? Primarily the surf candies. That being said, I'm trying to think of what's the other way that I would use it the most. And I mean, primarily surf candies, but probably I've used it for some of the circle hook bluefish popper setups where I'll tie the Supreme Hair or Ultra Hair off the back and then wrap a dubbing brush head on the front. And it's where I don't really care about the movement. Same thing with surf candies. Surf candies, you don't really care about the movement in the material. You're stripping that fly through a blitzing school of false albacore or striped bass, right? The same goes with the bluefish poppers. You know, I'm popping this thing and there's 15-pound bluefish chasing it. I'm not worried about having a ton of action in the fly. I'm worried about it being durable. So it's a good way of using it is in tail sections of flies where you don't care about movement necessarily, but you want them to be durable. So next up is Squimpish hair. Shout out to David and Stephanie Nelson. I've been part of their pro team, if you will, pretty much since like the start of the material. And as somebody who, even doing this professionally struggles making enough money to even be able to afford a $30 bucktail for hollow flies, I found the Squimpish hair to be perfect in terms of a replacement for bucktail in that particular fly. Now, David Nelson ties, he's got a very particular style of tying where he incorporates like salmon, steelhead, traditional style of flies with modern day fly tying. Very similar, I told him, very similar to Kenny Abrams, but kind of going the next level and the next step in the evolution of modern fly tying, but still going back to the old school roots and techniques and materials. So this is a synthetic material that's developed by somebody who really understands natural materials and ties flies traditionally with natural materials and really cares about the movement in the material. So Squimpish has great movement in the water. It's kind of a soft, subtle material, but it is still durable. There's really nothing else like it on the market. You will find like synthetic hairs like this, but not for fly tying. They're used in other different industries. But he's really, I think, the first one to kind of like market this sort of material, and that's one of the reasons why I love it so much and back it as well. It's such a fantastic material, particularly for hollow tying. And when it comes to Squimpish hair, it not only comes in their kind of traditional style, it comes in their boutique blends. They have all sorts of different variety of hairs. I highly recommend checking out their website. We even have a coupon code. You can use LIFliesMike for 15% off. I don't get any money from that, but it's a great way of supporting a company that I care about and is run by some awesome people. And almost just as importantly, it gives you folks a discount. So be sure to check out their website, squimpishflies.com. So what sort of techniques do I use Squimpish hair for? Well, traditionally, hollow ties is kind of my favorite and preferred way. The Squimpish hollows is kind of like traditionally how I've tied with this material in the past, but I find myself doing that a lot, but it is not limited just to hollow tying. You can really use it as a replacement to bucktail in quite a variety of ways. Now, it's much softer than bucktail. It's much more subtle, so it doesn't have that springiness to it. So a lot of times I will actually incorporate natural materials with it and blend it and do things like that. And, tie in some bucktail on the inside of the hollow ties, for instance. You can also just use it in traditional ties. You can do high-low ties. You can do V ties with it as well. I've tied some crab flies in the past and things like that. And I've also tied some awesome surf candies, taking the shorter hairs out and tying some surf candies because there's such a wide variety of awesome colors that they have available that I've just been inspired in the past before albie fishing and say, oh, I got to use that and tie a surf candy with some of that. Now, one thing that I've done in the past, but I really got to do more, I got to get my dubbing brush table set up upstairs somewhere, is David Nelson has been doing it a ton recently, but has been making dubbing brushes with the Squimpish hair. So I highly recommend if you go to any of these fly shows and you see Squimpish hair to check out their booth and talk to David Nelson and see if he's making any dubbing brushes. You can see it on their Instagram, I believe, as well. But you can make some fantastic dubbing brushes with the Squimpish hair, and you can just so easily tie some amazing large bait fish, musky, sort of striper patterns by just palmering, an inch or so of this Squimpish dubbing brush on there. So again, another good reason to get a dubbing brush table and potentially get into making your own dubbing brushes, because there's such a wide variety of dubbing brushes that you can make. A lot of times we get limited to these like smaller ones, like these EP ones, but you can make some quite large dubbing brushes as well. One of the things I love about Squimpish hair is that you can just cut it and then pull on the ends and taper it. A lot of times with certain even natural materials as well, right? Bucktail has a natural taper to it. If you flip it upside down, you'll have that thick end. With the Squimpish hair, it's pretty even overall, but you can even then take it and take the butt ends and taper it in your hands, and you essentially can just then fold it in half and cut it. And you won't even see where you cut it from the patch because it tapers very well in your hands. So that's a way to get the most out of your Squimpish hair, is to cut it in half, taper it in your hands, vice versa. You don't want to waste some of this very nice lawn material. And the ways that I use it most, like I said, are hollow ties. And when it comes to Squimpish flies, there's a wide variety of flies out there. Check out the Squimpish hollows that we have, and I highly recommend you check out David Nelson on Instagram, or Squimpish Flies, and check out his tying, because you can see there's a lot of stuff you can do with this material. You're not just limited to just hollow ties and things like that. So if you haven't, I highly recommend checking out Squimpish Hair and the folks over at squimpishflies.com. Now, one material that might surprise you that has become quite an effective material in my arsenal that you don't see tied with too often nowadays is wig hair and hair extensions. Now, this is, believe it or not, a very cheap and effective way of getting a very long material that works quite well for tying large bunker flies and large baitfish flies. Not just limited to bunker flies, obviously, but that's how I generally use it. Now, Mark Sadati has pretty much switched to using this wig hair for a lot of his bunker flies. He uses all sorts of synthetics, of course, but the wig hair you can get and the hair extensions you can find in just some of the craziest colors out there. Not only in just some bright and vibrant colors, but you can find colors that, you know, change throughout the length of the hair. There's obviously some wild hair extensions out there. So there is a difference between different hair extensions and wig hair. Some you'll find are more closer like a yak hair or synthetic yak hair, something like that. Some are more akin to something like a supreme hair or an ultra hair, something like that. So there are some differences. Not all wig hair or hair extensions are created equal, but it is a fantastic material for tying larger flies. You can see some of the photos of some of the larger Sadati slammers that Mark has tied, and some of the big fish that he's caught, particularly off places like Montauk and Block Island, using these. Something we haven't talked about yet is that the synthetics sink at a much even or faster rate than natural flies. Take a beast fly, right? And you take a Sadati slammer with a lead keel, and the Sadati slammer will sink at a much more even or faster rate. And that's the type of fly that you need when you're fishing off Block Island in like 80, 90 foot, for instance, and fishing off these humps in this fast moving water. And it just has to do with the way the material reacts and how the material is. Bucktail's naturally hollow, and the natural material, for instance, you know, bucktail, it just tends to sink slower than the synthetics. And it probably has to do with like the water resistance of the material and what the material is actually made out of, right? And how buoyant the natural versus synthetic is. But so in that regard, it's a fantastic material for tying these larger flies. And using it in V ties or high-low ties works great in 60-40, and just tying these sort of larger flies. And this goes back to like these Popovic's cotton candy flies, because a lot of the, you know, this bozo hair and stuff like that, a lot of this stuff is virtually kind of very similar to like cheaper wig hair, or some of these rougher wig hairs, I'll say, like the coarser wig hair. There's, you know, quite a wide variety of flies you can tie. You can even use this sort of material for the Cowan's baitfish, you know, the Magnum baitfish. Like I said, the Sadati slammers, fantastic fly for this material. There's like the wig flies. Shout out to Jay, who watches our live streams, and you'll see here comment on videos from time to time. He's located in Jersey, does a lot of striper fishing, you know, and the depths there are 19 or 15 to 20 feet where these bunker pods are. So it's a great place to fish a big fly for big striped bass. I was lucky enough to have him send me a huge haul of wig hair that we're going to be using to tie some synthetic slammers and other flies here in the near future. And he does a lot of fly tying with it as well. I'll make sure to include some photos of his flies. So how do I use this the most? Pretty much like Sadati slammer style flies with a heavy lead keel, using 0.035 diameter wire on a big hook, and being certain that I can get the fly down in deep water around structure or bars. If you're actually trying to imitate these big baits that you need for, you know, to really try and get that profile match down, this is a great material for that. One thing you can do is go to a shady gas station somewhere and look for some wig hair, and hopefully you don't get too many eyes when you know, get run up at the counter. Just tell them you're a fly tyer. So last but not least, we have wraps or body wraps. What you'll find with the boom of articulated flies like the Game Changer, a lot of trout flies that you'll see these articulated flies, is you can essentially create an entire fly using a body wrap with the synthetic material and then just trim the fly down to the shape that you want. So I'd say probably the Game Changer, Blaine Chocolate's Game Changer is probably the best example of this. And he even sells his own wraps, like Chocolate's body wrap, I think it's called. And again, this, I think I have something called the minnow wrap, which you'll see here on the video. It's essentially just taking some sort of synthetic fly and braiding it or stitching it together to where you can palmer it like you would a hackle or like a dubbing brush. And it's very easy material to tie with, very good for building a body or a head on a fly. And like I said, it could be used for the entire fly, essentially. Taking an articulated shank and slowly scaling up the size of the shanks and scaling up the size of the wrap, you can tie a Game Changer very easily, for instance. So it just comes down to trimming the fly and just making sure you wrap the material on there properly. It's a very easy material to work with at times, and it is quite forgiving as well. So you'll find, there's materials from everything similar to like an EP style, like this minnow wrap. I'd say it's very similar to like EP fiber-esque with some flash mixed in. And but you can find them in quite a wide variety, just like dubbing brushes, where they'll have every sort of consistency to the material, like whether it's coarse or sparse, whether there's flash or it's dull or long or short. Every day now they're adding more and more different wraps and brushes and things like that to the market. So what sort of flies can you use body wraps for? I mean, it's really the technique. You can really use it for all sorts of flies, but I'd say the most prevalent ones are like the Game Changer type flies, like I mentioned. Another thing, you can use it like in squid bodies, like we mentioned. If you don't want to have to V-tie for like a kinky mother, you could just wrap this. It will swim differently, right? Because of the way that the material is attached. And you're not like V-tying it on there, you're wrapping it. So just like a hackle, like the quill of the hackle can potentially affect the weight of the fly if the hook's not heavy enough. So you need to think about these things, but you can just kind of build any sort of body or head that you'd like with it, including baitfish heads. And how do I use this material the most? Really Game Changer and articulated type flies. I don't use it too often. I'm kind of like an old school sort of dude. But I'm slowly getting around to using some of these more modern fly tying materials. And probably once we, try and do some of the larger Game Changer-esque flies, we'll probably start dipping in and getting some different body wraps and playing around with that here on the channel. And with that, that is our pretty in-depth guide, if you will, to the synthetic materials that I use very often in my saltwater fly tying. Now, again, I'm sure there's tons of materials that I've missed. If there's any materials that I've missed here that you think are worth checking out, you'd potentially like to let some other fly tyers know, then feel free to let us know down in the comments below. I always try to read every comment and reply when I can. And I try to keep an eye out on suggestions and stuff like that. So I'm always interested in checking out either new flies and new materials and things like that. So if there's any synthetics that you think are worth checking out, then make sure to let me know down below. Well, hopefully you found this guide to saltwater synthetic fly tying somewhat useful. Like I said, I'm sure we missed some stuff. There's so many synthetic fly tying materials on the market nowadays compared to when I was a kid growing up. And it seems like more and more every year we're getting different types of materials and brands and brushes and wraps and all sorts of new and innovative techniques and flies and stuff like that. So when it comes to synthetic materials in the world of fly tying, there's really just a unlimited supply of materials, colors, and from everything from soft and subtle to stiff and crinkly. Really, the world's your oyster when it comes to fly tying nowadays, and there's just such a plethora of different materials you can choose from. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Again, this is our first series and our in-depth guide kind of talking about materials in saltwater and freshwater fly tying as well. A lot of this transitions over to a lot of freshwater tying techniques, but I figured someone asked about synthetics, and I figured it was a good place to start, particularly with how much synthetic material I've been using in my fly tying nowadays. So I plan on covering a wide variety of topics. We have natural hairs, we have feathers, we have wraps and bodies, We have even stuff like easy body and like legs and chenille. That could be a topic in itself, like utility materials or body materials. I don't know what we'd call it. There's a lot for us to talk about, and we'll probably even touch on synthetic materials again in the future. So if you have any ideas or any topics that you'd like to see covered here on the channel, then feel free to let me know in the comments down below, because really I'm always looking for new ideas and topics to potentially make videos on. And I wanted to say a big shout out to our Twitch subs and channel members. If you want to go the next step in supporting the channel here and you enjoy what we do here, then you can become a channel member. We have a couple different tiers and you can help support the channel that way. Of course, just watching the video and liking it, using your hype points that you get, 3 free hypes every week, that really helps as well. So I can't thank everyone enough when it comes to either just watching the videos and of course to everyone that becomes a channel member here. I couldn't do it without you. Well, thank you so much for watching. My name is Mike from LI Flies Mike. We have new fly tying and fly fishing videos coming out every week. We have live fly tying on Friday nights and early access for members. Have a great rest of your winter out there. It's tying season, so it's time to fill those fly boxes. And it'll be springtime before we know it, and hopefully the fishing season's a lot better this year. Well, till next time, as always, tight lines.